Take a network break. Choose from our fine selection of air-fried virtual donuts this week, glazed as always, but not jam-filled because that burns your mouth when you eat them. And join us as we peruse this week's tech news. Today, the news is focused on issues around 5G, AI investments, NVIDIA. Of course, Arista's doing some DPU stuff and struggles with Pluralsight as their business model fails rather extravagantly. We're sponsored today by Palo Alto Networks. Your branch has changed. Your SD-WAN should too. Palo Alto Networks wants to show you how AI and ML are powering the next-gen SD-WAN and SASE for the branch. SDX Central and Palo Alto Networks hosted an exclusive online event that shows you how their next-gen SD-WAN and SASE can help you modernize and secure your branches. Get over to SDX Central to see that. It's a free event. You can see the replay or check out the show notes for this episode of Network Break, where the link is there on the site. And also stay tuned after the news for a sponsored Tech Bites episode with network as a service provider, Meter. We explore how Meter delivers networking to its customers. It's a full service approach that includes software and hardware and operations. And we also discuss the role for IT and network engineers when consuming a network as a service offering. Drew's guest is Anil Varanasi, CEO and co-founder of Meter. And of course, if you like Network Break, check out the other podcasts on our network, Heavy Strategy, Packet Protector, which is our new cybersecurity podcast, and of course our newsletter, Human Infrastructure, which goes out every week. There's lots and lots of stuff across the site and growing. Find them all at packetpushers.net. Check out our website. Okay, Johna, let's get straight into our next topic. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about HPE delivering on 5G and selling off some of their operations. And this week, HPE published a post talking about a HPE Aruba Networking delivering a private 5G solution. I think there's a few things about this that I think would be relevant to the majority of people, which is building 5G POPs is actually really a major undertaking and very substantially different from existing wireless networking in how it operates, not only in the physical, because the whole signaling thing and the way the radio works in the 5G spectrum is radically different, but it's also extraordinarily different or divergent in a lot of ways from the software layers, which are not self-operating. What I mean by that is you put Wi-Fi solution in, you configure them all up, and you put in a Wi-Fi controller, and it's pretty much done. Whereas 5G is a much more complicated. It has a full software stack sitting on top of that. But I guess what HP's done here with its previously based around its acquisition of a startup called Ethernet was they simplified stripped out all the parts of public 5G to make it much more workable as a sort of a turnkey. They're claiming that in 30 minutes, you can turn up a private 5G solution at a site. So they must have gotten away from the telco idea, which is like this epic 12-month process of building a POP, to something much simpler and just stripped out all the things that they don't need. So I just wanted to say that because we sort of hinted last time that HPE must be getting out of private 5G. Clearly, we were wrong. They were just coming up with a different package.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to highlight is exactly what you said, Greg. They're really focusing on solving the enterprise issues around 5G, streamlining it, making it simpler, and very important in their announcement, one of the things they're trying to do is enable you to manage both private 5G and existing Wi-Fi together, particularly if you've got SD-WAN. So what that does is allow you as an enterprise to have a single management console for everything, every flavor of wireless, which is exactly what enterprise networkers want to do.
Yeah, you don't want to have one for the old days of having the so-called best of breed idea where you get this tool and that tool and this tool and you run them in little silos. That's going away.
And your customers, your users don't care whether they happen to be on private 5G or Wi-Fi, and they shouldn't have to care. So you need to be able to manage everything as one infrastructure.
Yeah, I think the security angle there, of course, is becoming increasingly important as well, where trying to manage diverse sets of technologies is actually becoming increasingly a security risk. The flip side of that is that you may not necessarily be buying the right solution. You might end up saying, well, I don't want to have to go and buy a best of. I sort of flip-flop around this sort of topic about, the death of the best of breed in a vertical versus buying it all from a single supplier. Going back, it feels a bit like mini computers from 30 years ago where you always went back to the same vendor because you wanted to have that single source sometimes. And then but I remember the value we got by diversifying our suppliers and, going white box and stuff.
It ends up that there's a wide range of procurement strategies from best in breed to, integrating best in breed and integrating everything together to single vendor, big rock to ecosystem, which turns out, based on our research, to be the most successful approach, which is you buy products that are already pre-integrated with other products. So you're buying not just one vendor, but 5 at once, because they already talk to each other. They've got integration from the management capability, et cetera, which is really what HP seems to be doing here or going after here, because they're not trying to displace Wi-Fi. They're saying we will work with it and allow you to manage it.
I think that makes sense from a sales point of view, because your sales motion goes out and says, oh, you've got wireless. Have you thought about buying some private 5G with that?
Well, and it also makes sense from an operational perspective. It turns out that it slows down the amount of integration you as a network engineer have to do, and at the same time reduces those risks of cybersecurity breaches, which, Greg, you pointed out.
So one thing I just want to point out about 5G is you can use unlicensed spectrum in the CBRS frequencies. That's the CB radio or citizen band radio. My speculation is that might already be quite crowded, because a lot of sites where you might want 5G, you might already be using that CB spectrum for handheld radios. And I would also point out that applying for and owning spectrum licenses is a full-time pain in the...
Yeah, right. You don't want to be doing that. We know that.
No, and that is something that's not just one and done. That's something that you have to do, and then you have to reapply every year, submit certain forms and things like that. So if you're actually trying to use private spectrum, you may actually end up outsourcing it, like you do if you've ever bought a microwave antenna running in restricted spectrums. Generally, you outsource the whole spectrum management thing with a contract to the microwave dish and say, here you go, Mr. Company, run the microwave for me. And they are part of that. They also manage the licenses to that spectrum and so forth on your behalf. So I think there's going to be some interesting situations where, as long as, getting it up and running in 30 minutes is fine if you're just going to use the open spectrum or the unrestricted spectrums. But if you're going to try and do something a bit more sophisticated, you're going to be in a world of hurt very, very quickly indeed. Anyway, I just wanted to pull that up because I think we might have gone off on the wrong tangent when we talked about HPE getting rid of some of those services, although I think we iterated in and said, like, it's a bunch of software at the top that's more closely related to provisioning and accounting systems.
It was much more, honestly, it wasn't about the services. It was really about the OSS, BSS that we talked about. And yes, HP is getting rid of the expensive, clunky, hard to manage stuff and zeroing in on the streamlined, easy to manage stuff.
So the next topic that we want to cover today is Cisco had its Cisco Live conference this week, and as always, they blasted out like about a squintillion announcements, and it's more than we can ever cover. There's just so many different articles going on that you can't actually give them anything. So I always ended up having to pick out just one or two that seem to be relevant. The one that I'm picking up on here is that Cisco's been making a big deal out of its AI, and it talks about making a $1 billion investment into AI companies. They made a really big deal about this, in fact, and led with it in certain places, and it sort of overshadowed a number of the other announcements. And I was kind of digging into this as to how they're going to do that. What does that look like? And what they're doing is the same old traditional stuff that Cisco does. See, Cisco's not a company that does things differently every time it does something. Once it finds a way of doing something, it tends to just keep repeating the same thing over and over. So it has a company called Cisco Investments. You can actually go and look at them online, ciscoinvestments.com. And basically what they're saying is that there's $1 billion over there, which they're calling an AI fund. And what Cisco normally does here is they invest in quite a few startups. And this means that they now have people on the board of those startups or people on the insides of those startups who are seeing, is this particular business a success or is it whatever? So they get this whole inside view of what these emerging markets look like. So it's really never been a lot of money in Cisco Investments, like relative to the size of Cisco and relative to what other investors are putting in the money. And $1 billion kind of sounds like a lot until you think about it, because for AI companies, it's basically pennies. So, for example, Elon Musk raised $6 billion in funding this week on a $24 billion valuation for his AI company. French startup Mistral AI has been speaking to investors about raising several $100 million at a valuation of $5 billion. Now, it should be noted that Cisco is an investor in Mistral AI already. They got something away. And, that's going to put them in good stead. And I noticed that Cisco is doing a number of partnerships with Mistral AI. You're seeing a number of bundles where Cisco is now bundling up various of its HCI stacks with Mistral AI to call them their AI solution or things like that. But my point here is that Cisco isn't really investing in generative AI as such. They're investing in companies that are doing AI on top of something else, right? Rather than saying, oh, we're going to build a model and generate and spend, serious amounts of money. They're dropping 50 million here, 150 million there into companies that have got some potential to turn it into something. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I would further add, I really want to highlight that point, because essentially what you're saying here, and I agree, is that Cisco is not going into competition with Microsoft, IBM, Google, and OpenAI. What they are doing is shoring up their existing competition with HPE. And what I mean by that is, with the Juniper purchase, HPE has invested heavily in the notion of self-managing infrastructure. and basically using AI and all other techniques and technologies to make the infrastructure easier to manage than the competition, which is, of course, Cisco. Cisco is looking at this, and if you look at some of the analysts' take on this investment, what they're saying is Cisco explicitly is saying, we will help you market through Cisco channels, we will help you sell in conjunction. And historically, Cisco has always kept an eye on these small companies, and when they're big enough to add value to Cisco mothership, just sucks them right back in and buys them. So essentially what Cisco is saying is, holy crap, our stuff is hard to manage, it's clunky, and it's outdated. Let's use AI to take that forward leap. Let's get AI so that it assists our customers in infrastructure management, invest in a whole portfolio of people who have different ideas of how to do that, and let the best startup win. We'll suck that back in and use that as our outsourced R&D, which I think is actually very smart, because
following the market. It's market following. Someone else is making the market, and they're walking a lot.
Exactly.
They're trying to stay as close as they can to the bank. But HP and Dell and Lenovo, they're all doing the same thing, right?
They are, but I think HP is, in this case, farther down the path simply because it's gone ahead and made that huge investment in Juniper a couple of years ago, which is going to kick in next year. And Juniper's whole raison d'etre, the reason anybody ever buys Juniper is it's essentially the same technology, but it is way sleeker and easier and cleaner to manage than Cisco gear. And
$1 billion is like peanuts for this market.
Yeah.
There's so much money sloshing around in AI as company, as
ridiculous amounts. But the way that Cisco's investing is actually not crazy, because it basically says this is our differentiated R&D for our future generation of products, particularly from a management and ops perspective. Great way to go. And Greg, I don't know if you wanted to go through all the other investments in AI, but I did want to highlight just by comparison. A week and a half ago, Alkira, which is a network as a service vendor, raised $100 million in Series C funding, which doesn't sound like a lot compared to the billions and billions, as you said, that are sloshing around the AI market. But what's interesting to me from this investment is that network as a service is not very sexy, but it's incredibly important. This is basically, how do you connect your infrastructure to multiple clouds with a single mouse click, as opposed to having to go into each cloud and set up and configure. And there are plenty of vendors in this space. The thing to me that is interesting about this investment is the fact that essentially it says network as a service is beginning to come of age. And it's something that networking folks are starting to really appreciate, because having network as a service really reduces setup time, reduces management time, and can reduce cost of connecting to multi-cloud.
Yeah, I think that whole network as a service is going to be a much slower, it's not going to be explosive like when we saw SD-WAN came, it was instantly, we knew instantly that it was going to be
that depends, Greg, because the original SD-WAN vendor was like 15 years before the SD-WAN bubble. I think the difference here is that network as a service doesn't touch end users particularly. It only affects network engineers, network ops folks who are starting to get overwhelmed with the requirements of connecting to multi-cloud.
Yeah, there's a certain type of customer who has a multi-cloud networking problem. They have to be multi-cloud, right? Multiple data centers.
Which is pretty much all of them.
One of the biggest ones I've seen is companies who acquire other companies.
Yes.
And all of a sudden you've got 4 or 5 different companies under a loose umbrella. Some of them have got Google Cloud, some of them have got AWS Cloud, some of them got Oracle Cloud, and then you've got 4 different on-prem data centers, infrastructures, like how do you bring all that together into a unified whole? That's where I think this network as a service has
absolutely anyone with a hybrid cloud, which is basically everyone, because unless you're a very new company, you probably have a private data center. You need to connect to that. You also have a public cloud service. You need to connect to that. So it's extremely important and interesting, but I'm just highlighting the order of magnitude difference between the investment that's going into the fun, sexy, AI versus necessary, but to most people, except Greg and me, boring network as a service.
Let's move on to talk about NVIDIA. I mean, what would a week in technology be without talking about NVIDIA every second conversation? NVIDIA CEO is at Computex in Taiwan this week, basically repeating previous conference keynotes. I didn't see much that was new, except for the fact that Jensen Huang was actually talking mainly focused on his CUDA software. So even though he's in Taiwan, which is, of course, the center of the hardware universe, there was lots of hardware slides that he was putting out about infrastructure and things like that. But really, he spent much like the newest conversations went around, oh, we've got these new GPUs which were made by TSMC or this new other stuff out there. He really spent some time talking about CUDA, and then so the conversation in the media has been, NVIDIA's real lock-in is not in the hardware; it's actually in the CUDA software that runs on the top. We've talked that a lot. There was some networking news though. Jensen was up on stage with some slides. There's a link in the show notes if you want to see the presentation. They're planning for 800 gigabits per second networking in 2025 and then 1.6 terabit per second networking in 2026. So this 800 gig is actually needed. If you're running PCIe Gen 6 buses inside of the servers, you actually need 800 gig networking on a single host to be able to do that. I don't think there's going to be many people who have servers that need 800 gig, but for AI, it's absolutely needed. And then the announcement was focused on Spectrum X, which is the name for the current generation of silicon, featuring the NVIDIA Spectrum SN5600 Ethernet switch. And of course, they're promoting the BlueField-3. They're calling it a SuperNIC, but it's a DPU. Talking about AI-specific features, adaptive routing and congestion control for maximum bandwidth and noise isolation, as well as enabling cloud multi-tenancy GPU compute. So basically, Jensen spent enough time basically touting his network leadership in this space. And I did get a little bit of a nah sort of thing saying, we've got networking and nobody else has. And you know what? He's kind of right.
He is right. Yeah, I'm happy with that. And just on another note on NVIDIA, to put this all in broader context, their market cap just cruised past Apple's. They are now 3.1012 trillion compared to Apple's 3.003, which makes them the second most valuable company in the world. Any guesses as to who the first one is? Microsoft.
It's Microsoft, isn't it?
It is Microsoft, yes. But that makes NVIDIA more valuable, at least at the moment, than Amazon or Google, which is kind of interesting.
But equally the most precarious. Because it's a one-horse pony, right? It's a one-trick pony. It's not a diversified business.
It really isn't. That's the thing. It's hardware and software, and it is all of its hardware and software is next generation. It has zero legacy problem compared to, say, Amazon. Well, Amazon is totally different. They're just unto themselves. They're sui generis.
10 years ago, people would have said this is a bubble because it's a one-trick pony company.
10 years ago they would have, but it's not. But it's not anymore because they've intelligently invested in futureware. I think they're doing pretty well. Oh,
come on! It's a hype. It's a hype cycle. The people investing in NVIDIA know it's a nervous investment. It's not like they're not even making the sort of revenue to justify that valuation.
Well, it's a hype cycle the same way. It's a hype cycle the same way Google's a hype cycle. I mean, Google basically until 2 years ago, 98% of its customers were advertisers. It sold eyeballs to advertisers. Not very exciting, and they were always very precarious. Now they're starting to get into actually selling things. There's not much difference between
NVIDIA's stock price and a Bitcoin at the moment.
I disagree, actually. Our clients tend to be using NVIDIA, and while Bitcoin is speculated upon. So there's a difference. Big difference between speculating on something
I didn't say it was a completely congruent call. I just said there's definite aspects to this. Like, at some point, the valuation, can NVIDIA actually generate enough money to justify that valuation?
Well, Google did, and it did it selling something that has zero value. But that's neither here nor there. So let's go on.
Let's take a break to thank our sponsor. We're sponsored today by Palo Alto Networks. Your branch has changed. Your SD-WAN should too. Palo Alto Networks wants to show you how AI and ML are powering the next generation SD-WAN and SASE for the branch. SDX Central and Palo Alto Networks hosted an exclusive online event that talked about the next generation of SD-WAN and SASE that can help you modernize and secure your branches. And I know that most networks haven't yet. It's surprising to me still, after talking about SD-WAN for over a decade, that it's still only reached 20 to 30% market penetration. It's staggering to me. Anyway, go over to sdxcentral.com to get a link to this free event, or check out the link in the Packet Pushers show notes for this episode 482. All right, let's go on with the news. Thanks very much to Palo Alto for supporting us, by the way. We wouldn't be here without
it. Thank you very much. And Greg, I think this is your chance to talk about, anyone that's been following Network Break will have known this announcement was coming, right?
That's right. So this was the announcement this week by Arista that they have put their EOS software as an AI agent onto NVIDIA BlueField DPUs. So this is Arista's EOS is, of course, the universal operating system. They only develop one operating system and then take it to multiple platforms, right? So basically it's a version of Linux, can run anywhere, and they're basically doing a hell of a job of making it run on wireless, on campus switches, on data center switches, and all the stuff. So what they've done here is build an EOS-based agent enabling the network and the host to communicate with each other for AI clusters. By putting an AI agent on the BlueField DPU inside of the servers, EOS running on Arista switches can be extended to directly attach NICs to allow a single point of control and visibility. So what that means is that you can be configuring queues or routing or VLANs or whatever it is, IP addressing, and you could push that directly into the BlueField DPU, which is inside your server. Now, this is a remote AI agent hosted directly on the BlueField-3 SuperNIC, or DPU as I'd call it. Everybody's got to come up with some sort of bloviation about this sort of stuff. But it also can run on a server. So if you don't have a BlueField NIC, you can actually run the EOS agent on the server, and then you can use it to do telemetry, configuring and monitoring, debugging problems on the server, end-to-end QoS and QoS consistency. I think this is Arista's play here around Ultra Ethernet. There's no way in my mind that you can just do this in the switch. You have to be doing this inside the server. That's been apparent probably now for over 15 years, ever since 2010, when it became clear that the only way you're going to stop congestion in the network is by throttling it at the edge. But you've got to actually have a pipeline where you have the end-to-end capability. And I think Arista's being smart here by saying, well, if customers are all running NVIDIA GPUs, which they are for AI, and they're probably all NVIDIA wants to sell them these BlueField DPUs. Let's put our EOS agent on the DPU and sell it as an independent so you can run it on a server, and we can extend our network inside the server. Does that strike you as comprehensive? Or
that is pretty comprehensive, and I just want to reiterate the fact that anyone listening to this show probably knew this was coming because Greg announced that this was very likely to be the next step several years ago. So every now and then we can keep you ahead of the curve.
Yeah, well, the DPUs, basically there is a switching ASIC on there to some extent, but there's also a bunch of ARM CPUs and memory modules, and, basically it's a computer on there. And the real value is the software that runs on those DPUs, and it offloads from the server CPUs, right? So you could actually run a VMware hypervisor on a DPU, right? So why not put this agent on there? And one of the things here is that networking companies have been very reluctant to get inside the server. VMware's NSX has managed to build an enormous piece of market share, by taking security and putting it into the NSX agent, and by taking the networking and just running an overlay over the physical network. I've never quite understood why was it that networking vendors didn't say, well, we can do that too. Why aren't they building these virtual software tools? They never did. Cisco tried it and failed. ACI didn't work out. Its ability to write a software agent never worked out. Arista's just been busy doing something else. But I think AI is sort of forcing them down this path. I think you'll see, Cisco announcing something in this space in time, as will, all the other vendors. Dell will have to do the same thing. They've already announced
It's an interesting point. You're saying all the other vendors will pick up and do this thing that they didn't do before. And I was sort of mulling why they haven't done it. And I think the answer is because it's just a little bit harder than they thought it was. And they were just not prepared to put in the extra investment. But interestingly, when you mention the fact that they can use AI to do that, I think downstream, they're going to, you're right. There are a lot of cases where people have thought of an idea, thought that they could do it, discovered it was just that much too hard that they decided to stick to their knitting, and AI will actually act as the impetus to go ahead and take that leap. So it'll be interesting to see how the market sort of shakes itself out over time.
Well, I think VMware's proven that it works as well.
Yeah, yes, but VMware but they were always a software company. That's the thing. Cisco pretended to be a software company.
Well, in the early days, everybody told me that NSX would never work. Remember that? I remember when it first came out, it would never work. It was a failure.
No, I actually don't, because I remember in the early days telling everybody, this is the company you have to watch. This is game-changing. Pay attention, because we're going to be in a totally different place 12 months from now. And I remember making that comment in 2004.
Companies like Cisco, who have networking and security portfolios, are being caught flat-footed because the security is now being folded into that virtual switch, right?
Exactly.
And they should have been doing this 5 years ago, whereas now now Palo Alto can come and do this. Now, Palo Alto and Fortinet could just as easily produce this agent and build a competitor to NSX without too much effort, I don't think.
Well, we could debate this for a while, but I know we do need to wrap up, and we have a couple more interesting things. I know you wanted to talk a little bit about ARM deciding to gain 50% of the Windows PC market share. And before you talk about this, my only question is why?
Well, sometimes what CEOs do is they just say stuff that investors want to hear. I call it, have you ever followed the manifesting thing, where people say, I'm going to manifest,
yes.
and there's this And on social media, there's this woman on TikTok and she's going like, I'm looking for a man in finance, trust fund, blue eyes, 6'5", or something like that, right?
And I'm like, that is the most boring man in the world, but never mind. And sorry, my apologies to any of you who happen to be in finance with the trust fund, blue eyes, and 6'6", but really. But yes, I understand. But still, why would you even manifest this? Like, this is a market that is slowly in decline. Why do you want half of it?
Well, because I think the interesting thing here is that so basically the CEO is saying that he aims to gain more than 50% of the Windows PC market in 5 years.
Right.
That is obviously not going to happen. Do you think Intel's going to stand still and not do something to react to this?
I was just talking to Intel yesterday. They are absolutely not standing still. They are very aggressively retaliating. They've been caught flat-footed for the past couple of years, and they are licking their wounds, gathering their forces, whatever cliche you want. And no, they're not going to let that happen.
So basically, I'm here to puncture this guy's bloviation because I think it's waffle. But still, I have very low confidence that ARM CPUs will grow the overall super PC market. I think the dominance of iPads, tablets and smartphones is basically ending the laptop market to some significant.
Exactly.
And for them to get 50% means Intel must lose really significant market share.
And they're not going to let it happen. No.
No. Well, Intel is vulnerable, but they're not going to do nothing. Right.
Yes, exactly.
Right. And Intel gets $7 billion per quarter from Client Computing Group. That's the laptops, desktops, and so forth. Yep. AMD is the other person in this bundle because they get $1 billion from the sales of processors to laptops. Now, Qualcomm has developed an ARM chip. It's not ARM making chips. They license them. So they have to rely on companies like Samsung and Qualcomm to take their technology and then actually turn it into a piece of silicon and ship it. And I also have very low confidence that Microsoft will ship a reliable or secure system. And
wait, you don't think Microsoft is going to come to the forefront of security? Wait, their entire business model is to sell you something that's inherently vulnerable and then sell you more stuff to fix it. The vulnerability.
But at the same time, there's absolutely a battery problem, right?
Yes,
the Intel processors are just not delivering the battery life, and ARM processors have proven, iPads, smartphones, of all the sorts. They're just way, way ahead here. Qualcomm's got every motivation to dance on Intel's market share all that it can. I certainly think that ARM will be successful, but it won't be 50% of the laptop market within 5 years. But what I'm also concerned, there is a gap here. Microsoft is apparently really, really committed this time. Like, Microsoft has always played with this ARM market by saying, they put out a press release saying, we've ported Windows to ARM. Is anybody interested? It's never been anything more than that. Does that make sense?
It does. And actually, I'm a little surprised by Microsoft placing this bet. I think you're right. You zeroed in on the most important part of this entire announcement. Obviously, ARM has to say all sorts of, we're going to do great things and manifest everlasting success. I just see it's interesting that it's a recognition of inherent weakness of its own, Microsoft's that is. But at the same time, I don't think this, for all the reasons you said, I don't see this bet playing out the way either Microsoft or ARM thinks it's going to.
No, but I also think that Microsoft is being forced to. So Apple's laptops are taking share. They are absolutely eating into the share of laptops. Generally, I believe that Macs might be as much as 30% of new sales of laptops in the current.
Yeah, it's creeping up. It's interesting to find whenever we talk to our clients how much of an inroad Macs have made in non-traditional sorts of organizations. They've traditionally been the platform of choice for anyone artistic or creative. It's also the case that Apple is not super interested in the laptop market. They're much more interested in all their other devices, which makes sense because the profits are much higher. But be that as it may, it's interesting that ARM is making
the laptop market doesn't have the numbers, right?
Exactly.
So,
it also doesn't have the profit margin.
I disagree. I think Apple's computing devices, the Macs and the both laptops and desktops and all the things, I think they're just so overshadowed by the rest of the organization that it's very difficult. It's very easy to get sucked into the vision. But Apple laptops is currently, I think they are the single largest supplier of laptops at the moment. Compared to say,
it could be.
Dell
I'm
or
saying
HP
what I'm saying is they're always the ugly stepsister in the Apple family because they
when
continue
you're a
to
$3
make
trillion company,
exactly.
and you're moving
and it's like a measly $1 billion here, $1 billion there. You don't care, and they also really don't want us all using laptops in the long run. We want to use laptops.
No.
They don't want us using laptops. Anyway.
I think Apple is happy. I think everybody will be using laptops. I think there'll be a significant portion of the market that uses laptops, and that's just going to go on forever. There's
unless and until they come up with a new user interface. Because remember, we're all using the user interface that was developed by Xerox PARC in the 1970s. So it's been a while.
It's been a while. And, to some extent, are we habituated to it? Maybe so.
Well, we old farts are.
Let's move on to talking about online training. Now, many people will remember Pluralsight was a very well-known training organization. And about 3 years ago, it was taken private. There was an article here coming out from Axios.com. It was a scoop by them, in fact, announcing that Vista Equity, which is the private equity firm, is writing off Pluralsight's value after a $3.5 billion buyout. So I did some digging into this. It turns out that Vista Equity has written off the book value of Pluralsight, which is rumored to be as much as $3.5 billion, because that's what they paid for it. So potentially it's more if they valued it up. The Pluralsight has over $1 billion in debt that urgently needs $50 million in funding to meet interest payments this month. Right, it's got to do it now. And there's a bit of a dodgy thing happening here, which is actually getting some interest from other people. I'll try and keep this short because financial news is not necessarily technology news, but it's important, I think. Vista Equity actually set up a subsidiary of Pluralsight and then moved the intellectual property of Pluralsight into that organization and then loaned $50 million to that subsidiary of Pluralsight against that intellectual property. So what they've actually done is just said, we'll loan you $50 million against a secured debt. So what they did was just stole that intellectual property from the Pluralsight shareholders and then gave them a loan against it. And that's actually getting some scrutiny from the SEC and, in effect, moving the assets beyond the reach of owners in the event of a default, which is looking increasingly likely. So on one hand, this dodgy piece of accounting keeps Pluralsight running for a bit longer and perhaps a turnaround is possible, but it's going to be interesting to see whether Pluralsight can make it. I just look back at Pluralsight. It was such a huge success there for a while. Do you remember that? And then all of a sudden it just faded away.
I don't remember it actually being that huge a success, although I know you're correct. It was. I do think that the approach was fundamentally flawed. So I'm not surprised to hear any of this, and I would basically bet against that turnaround happening, which I think is something you're thinking as well.
Yeah, so I think the lesson to be learned here, and this is something that we see a lot, is that when Pluralsight was bought, it was being pitched as a workforce development company.
Yes.
So they were making the point that we've got this online training business. We've worked out a way to really cheaply create content and then sell it at scale to companies. So the idea was that people like me would go and write concept for Pluralsight, and then they would sell it to people and, in a way. And they went off and said, well, this is actually going to be the future of education, bloviation, right? Very WeWorky type of thing,
exactly.
Right? And Vista Equity bit off on that idea. And then they started saying, well, we're going to sell computing training to schools in America, and Pluralsight is going to be our platform because it's this online training platform, blah, blah, blah. But, of course, Vista Equity Partners couldn't help themselves as a private equity. The first thing they did was take all of the cash out of the business, load it up with a bunch of debt, which was all right when interest rates were low. But now that the debt financing is now up around the 5 to 10% mark for corporate bonds, it's now killing them because they've just got so much debt that the company's going broke. So entirely predictable and entirely very private equity.
Yep, entirely predictable, entirely private equity. Last but not least, we wanted to talk about the Australian government not rescuing the breached medical provider.
Yeah, I have a bit of a theme here saying cybersecurity doesn't matter. And it's something that I've been, banging on the source pen with the lid saying cybersecurity doesn't matter. Nobody cares. Every time something horrible happens in cybersecurity, everybody sort of goes, But this is an interesting one. Let me just preface this with a little bit of background here, because I don't think many people will know that the Australian healthcare system is a combination of both private and public services. So that is, some part of the system is government run. So you go to a hospital and some of them will be run by a government department, and they are fully, government operated. But you can go to another hospital and it's fully private. That is, it's run by a corporation. And this is kind of a recognition that for-profit companies are not always the right answer. And perhaps also that it takes time for companies to enter markets that were previously regulated. So there's no way you can suddenly sell off your healthcare system and suddenly turn it into a public or turn it into something private. But it also allows the Australian government to get new approaches to parts of healthcare. So if a company comes up with this idea and says to the government, well, we want to provide healthcare as a private service, the government can say, oh, we'll give it a go and see if it's efficient. And if they don't, it doesn't turn out. So what happened was MediSecure was a private company that was trying to be an online prescription provider, acting as a middleman between doctors and pharmacies under a contract with the Australian government. They were breached in mid-2023. And seems that the hackers were inside the organization for about 6 months. And so this was at around about the time that MediSecure lost the contract and it was awarded to another party. So they have to compete for the contract. They lost the contract. It now looks like they failed to keep up the IT. So maybe they didn't keep the headcount in place. The system was still online, maybe as it was running down, or maybe they were trying to keep the company running to go back to bid for another piece of business. Anyway, so the final result is that MediSecure is now gone into bankruptcy after going to the Australian government and saying, can you bail us out? So does cybersecurity matter? The data's out there. It's all lost. The company's gone. Nobody's going to get punished. Who cares?
Well, and as you said, the message is kind of clear. The Australian government is saying lack of planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on ours.
No, but I think the trick here is that the people are responsible. Like, you can say it's a company and liability resides in the company, but people made decisions here which ultimately resulted in medical records being spilled online. Apparently the hackers were looking for $500,000 and the data has been validated to be actually stolen from MediSecure. And I also note that MediSecure's motto, the saying, every company's got a byline, sent, secure, safe.
Oopsie. Yeah.
Yeah. So next time a company tells you safe, or secure, don't believe them. I just think it's interesting that this plays out. They had a contract, they lost the contract. It seems to me like what happened here is the company said cybersecurity is an optional extra, and now they're out of business. And why would you bail them out, right?
Exactly. I mean, you've been making this point for a while, Greg, that unless and until there are real consequences for breaches, nothing's going to change.
Yeah, there's that big healthcare breach in America, and now the Senate, the U.S. government, the federal government, is piping up. I think Ron Wyden, who's sort of like the internet senator, I think is how I sometimes think of him. He's now going after the CEO of that company, of the American one, saying you didn't hire a CISO with sufficient skills, and therefore you should be held liable.
Well, and I think that example is a very good one because previously, in fact, up until very recently in the U.S., the tendency has been to punish the CISO ahead of punishing the CEO, which makes absolutely no sense because in most organizations, the CISO isn't necessarily an officer of the company. So you're basically taking somebody who has an operational role and treating him or her as though they have a leadership role and letting the leadership off scot-free, which is just plain wrong.
Because the CISO is then just going to spend most of his time covering his butt. Like, I took this decision to the CEO and they refused to give me funding. Where does that leave you?
More than that, to take that job, any sane CISO, and I published an advisory about this called the $10 million CISO. Essentially, it's like take $10 million, put it in an escrow for that point where you try to send me to jail for your mistakes. I need to provide for my family. And once you get smacked with the fact that a good CISO is going to cost you that much because nobody sane is going to take that kind of risk, maybe you'll figure things out.
Maybe. Anyway, it's just an interesting one because the Australian system is quite unique and very different to the US and the UK and the European systems in lots of different ways because of its mix of private and public healthcare. But the Australian government also is pretty harsh when it decides to go down a particular path. So it's worth reading up on this in the sense that does cybersecurity matter? And I think actually my takeaway from this is no, nobody's going to get in trouble for this. Everybody's going to go like, oh, the company's gone bankrupt. It happened a year ago. Yeah, the data's out there. And once again, cybersecurity doesn't matter.
I would say no, not really, because now the company's gone bankrupt, which is a good thing. That's a positive thing. That's a movement in the right direction. That said, there's a long way to go yet.
Well, that's enough for today's show. Thanks very much, Johna, for joining me. Where can people find out more from you?
Hit us up at nemertes.com, nemertes.com, nemertes.com.
And stay tuned for our Tech Bytes conversation with Meter about their network as a service product. That's coming right up. Welcome to the Tech Bytes podcast. Today we're talking about network as a service, or NAS, with sponsor Meter. There's a couple of different ways to look at network as a service, so we're going to get Meter's perspective on how it delivers networking to its customers. It's a full service approach that includes software, hardware, and operations. We also talk about the role for IT and network engineers when consuming a network as a service offering, among other subjects. My guest is Anil Varanasi. He is CEO and co-founder of Meter. Anil, welcome to Tech Bytes. So let's start it off, set the table. What's Meter's approach to network as a service?
Drew, thanks for having me. I think fundamentally our approach is how to do things end to end. When we think about network as a service, it should encompass everything from ISP, network design, rack build out, but really the products and services that come with it. We've been around about a decade now, and we believe there haven't been really great products in the last 5, 10 years for local networking. And so what we've been spending time doing is building all the stack from the ground up, thinking about the hardware, the firmware, the operating systems, the distributed systems, the APIs, and the dashboards of it. And we believe there's to be great products to be built for network engineers, and then services along with that as well. So for us, NAS is how to think about product and service together and how to build that from the ground up. And we view our customers as network engineers and IT teams everywhere.
Okay. Yeah. So just to be clear, we're not talking about the network as a service as some kind of cloud delivered option. Meter is actually building its own hardware, coming on site, setting up the hardware and software, and running the service for you.
Yeah. And really end to end. So today, when somebody comes to us, we ask them for an address, a floor plan.
Like a physical address, like what street am I going to?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Where is this address actually? Give us a floor plan, and then answer some questions about how things are connected. How is it going site to site or site to cloud to a POP to whatever? And then a full network is built out on top of that. We go procure the right ISPs for the customers. We're ISP agnostic. Then we'll work with the networking engineering teams and IT teams for network design and site surveys and really building out the rack. We want to, and we do build racks that we're proud of, from IDFs and MDFs by the dozens for some of our customers in a single location. Then it's all meter hardware across security appliances, switches, access points, and then software for observability, for control, and then SD-WAN, site-to-site, IPsec, DNS security, and VPN, all built into a single pane of glass.
Okay, and then so you actually come on site, you do the site survey, then you deploy the equipment. You're racking the gear, you're turning it on, you're putting up the APs and so on?
That's right.
Okay, that's amazing. So what kinds of organizations or verticals are you targeting with your approach?
We're seeing the biggest pull from enterprises across retail, manufacturing, warehouses, life sciences, and classic campuses and offices. And then the other one is in education. But the commonality between all of these is that these are customers where enterprise networking matters and connectivity matters for their customers and their colleagues and their systems. And on top of that, these teams are being asked to do a lot. What we see over and over again is that IT teams are not able to grow headcount as much as they used to, and they're being asked to do more than they ever have. So similar to what AWS and others might have done for DevOps teams as being an extension, we're hoping to do that for IT and networking teams, where if they partner with Meter, they get better hardware, software, and a partner that can help scale their networking operations.
And I just want to make it clear so listeners understand, you're not like a VAR bringing in, the usual suspects equipment. You've built your own, including the software and the hardware.
Yeah. Painstaking 10 years to build everything from the ground up. We fundamentally believe there's a lot of different, better ways to do three important aspects of core networking, which is how do you do packet processing, how do you do packet mutation, and how do you move packets in the first place. And what we spent a lot of time doing is working on each parts of this for different parts of the stack across security appliances, across switches and APs. So the hardware is ours. We design it. We manufacture it in Taiwan. We partner with Intel and Qualcomm and Marvell, those folks for the chipsets, and really think about building great hardware and phenomenal software to tie it all in together.
You also mentioned you procure the ISPs. Can you go into that a little bit? Because that can often be frustrating for customers.
Here's the brief that started it all for us maybe 7-8 years ago on this product and how we think about it. Today on the internet, you can buy anything. You can buy airlines. You can buy obviously books and other things, but you can't buy the internet on the internet at all. And
ironically,
really ironically. So we set out to see, can we solve that from the ground up for our customers, which are IT and networking teams? So when that physical address that we asked for is put in, we go do the work, and we've been building on APIs and proprietary access and real custom software to deliver. The simplest way to understand this is Kayak or Expedia, but for ISPs. Give us an address. We show a list of options, and you can say, I want dedicated fiber, I want, coax, or my budget is this, or, I really like one provider versus another. And we show all that availability in a single spot, all in software, in the same pane of glass where your networking observability is and networking control is as well.
And are you actually making the call to that ISP to get someone to come out to set up that connection, whatever it might be?
That's right. So contracting is built in to our platform as well. So if you just say, hey, I want to go ahead and purchase this, the contract ends up in your inbox. And then on top of that, we also have consolidated billing as well. This is particularly great for our enterprise customers that might have hundreds and thousands of locations and primary and secondary. And you're talking about potentially thousands of ISPs to manage, all in a single consolidated billing platform. So as silly as it sounds, a lot of times IT teams forget to pay their ISP bills, and that's what brings down the networks.
Is that true?
Yeah, with consolidated billing, that's just all automatic, and we build software for that as well.
Yeah, I can see if I'm running a retail organization that's got hundreds or thousands of branches, having to just figure out who my provider is and then managing the billing could be a real pain. So that seems like it could be a service by itself, but that's just part of the whole package with Meter.
Part of the package, that's right. Yeah, again, you were mentioning earlier on how we think about NAS and what does that mean, and I think the term has gotten so convoluted in the last 4 or 5 years, right? It means so many different things for different people. For us, historically, they've been really great product companies and they've been really great service companies. So vendors that built a bunch of hardware or folks that service it. What we've been working on and thinking about is how does this all come together? And that's been the pursuit of the last decade for us. We ended up writing about this, and it's actually at nas.com, NAS.com, for others if they're curious on how to go or go read about it and how we think about it. But the reason we go do all this end to end is, again, to service our customers. And you can't have a great network in any location without any of these pieces. Without great ISPs, without great networking hardware, software, SD-WAN, security, you can't have a great network. So that's why we ended up building it from the ground up, fully integrated, all of these pieces.
Okay, so I've got the connectivity set up. You've come in, you've deployed all the gear, the switches are running, the APs are on, I've got connectivity. What else? Is there anything else that Meter's providing, or do you just sort of set it up and go, here you go, and leave it to me, and you're done?
Yeah, so there's two separate models here, right? Sometimes customers want to co-manage the networks with us, and other times they want us to manage the networks entirely ourselves. Okay. Again, if we use the AWS model, if you go spin up a bunch of servers on EC2, you might get great defaults, but you might have an engineering team that has particular opinions on changing something there, and they should be able to. And the thing that we're trying to do is we're not looking to make networks invisible or something like that. We think engineers should have even more control on their networks and have really great visibility on it. So what we do is help manage these networks, where we're monitoring these networks across the entire stack, but then also really give that control for customers and engineers to be able to do it. And for us, the services that sit on top are, whether it's ISP renewal or site-to-site or SD-WAN or DNS security that's application and policy-based, and being able to do all of those things are all integrated in our system.
Yeah, so can you give me a sense of what I would do if I'm a network engineer and I'm using your service and I go into your console? What am I looking at, and what can I touch? What can I get my hands on? What can I customize?
So ideally, over time, you should be able to customize everything. And Meter should be the best software available for network engineers to be able to customize their networks. But an example might be is Meter's powering the network across a retailer of hundreds of locations. Maybe they're bringing in a new POS system. Maybe they're bringing in a new camera system. Maybe they're bringing in new access control. Then being able to change everything from VLANs to policy-based routing to firewalls to radio profiles, all of that is built in as well. We ship great defaults as we're onboarding and working with our customers, but we still believe engineers who are deploying other things and responsible for a system and have a team that they're working with should also be able to do those things.
Okay. And what about, troubleshooting? If an end user says, I can't access the network, whose responsibility is the troubleshooting and the resolution?
So ideally, we're proactively showing which client devices are having issues and pushing that to our customers. But on top of that, we've built out health metrics on client level, access point level, wireless, what's happening with ISPs, host monitoring, all in a single place. Now, the responsibility, depending on how a networking team is set up, is shared responsibility or is Meter's responsibility as well. We have both of those models.
Okay, so I can use Meter sort of maybe like a first line of troubleshooting, but if I need to go deeper, I can do it myself or vice versa?
That's right. That's exactly right.
You mentioned some security components to the service. Can you talk about the capabilities there?
Yeah, so things from stateful firewall all the way up to DNS security built in. So in DNS security, going as deep as saying this VLAN shouldn't be allowed to use this application or this domain. We have it built in from the ground up, from the stateful firewall to layer 7.
So stateful firewall, DNS security, are there other things, segmentation and so on?
Yeah, segmentation, VLANs, zero trust, security around inter-VLAN communication, on how we do role-based access control, how we do validations, all of those things. I'm happy to enumerate on any one of them that might be useful to hear about.
Yeah, maybe if you could talk a little bit more about what you can do with VLANs, for example.
Yeah, so in VLANs, there's kind of two ways we think about it, and it's a good representation of how we think about our networks from the ground up. Mm-hmm. So you should be able to arrive at any security on VLANs and being able to add VLANs, being able to look at what clients are on there with SSIDs, but also going as far as customizing DHCP mappings to DNS down to it, and then also attaching policies to it. So that might be a DNS policy, that might be firewall rules. What we'd like to do is have our software be available bottoms up to any particular client and then go to any security, or tops down, that's policy based down. So if you're saying I'm going to construct this VLAN and I want it to affect all my SSIDs and these types of clients, both are available all the way through the software.
I'm sure people are thinking, okay, this sounds good, but can I, I've got my favorite, wireless provider. Can I use your switching and security, but keep my APs?
Yeah, we're all or nothing on security appliances, switches, access points, but we do hear customers on this. So for enterprises that have existing gear from legacy providers, we do have a buyback program to make sunk costs easier. And what we want to do is, again, hear our customers, right? If I'm in an IT team, networking team, one of the hardest things challenging is, even though I love Meter's product and what software we built in the service, I might have just gone to my finance and procurement teams a year ago, 2 years ago, and asked for a budget on buying switches or APs. Right. So we want to work with our customers. The buyback program is really simple to be able to make it easy to switch from a legacy provider over to Meter as well.
Okay. If I just went and bought new Wi-Fi 6 APs and then I discover Meter and decide I want to go that route, I don't just throw that money into a hole. I can maybe use it as credits or something with Meter. Is that how it works?
That's right. Yeah. And no finance team is going to let a networking team throw it away anyway.
Yeah. So what's next for Meter? Where do you guys think you can take this model?
So I think deeper and deeper into networking teams, what we're working on is really doing the basics right. I think there's all this like fancy and flashy things we could talk about and show and try to do it. But what we really believe is networking, if you do the basics really well and provide great software and great visibility to customers, that goes really far. So what's next for us is going deeper into observability. We're building out a bunch of things over the last few years that I think customers really enjoy, where we can push the industry further. And then also on control. Now, dashboards have been a certain way the last few decades, or particularly the last 10, 15 years. But if I'm managing a location where I'm 200 miles away, 2,000 miles away, or if I'm managing 10 locations, if I'm managing 100 locations, maybe I'm managing 1,000 locations, can software help with that? So most of what we have coming is really doing the basics really right, getting observability to a level the industry hasn't pushed, especially on local networking. I think cloud has done some really interesting things in the last 10 years in data centers. But then what does actual management and control look like? And how can I actually manage these networks that are getting increasingly complicated, not just in the classic point and click dashboard fashion? How can I take it further? We've got a bunch of things that we've been working on the last 2-3 years.
Okay. Yeah, it's nice to hear someone talk about getting the basics right, because that's often where a lot of problems start.
Yeah. And, fundamentally, everything is a packet. right? And again, being able to do packet processing, packet mutation, packet movement really well across every layer of the stack, I think goes really far. And so when you come talk to the folks here at Meter, they've been doing networking for decades. We really care about the basics, and we try to also recruit and hire folks who believe in doing the basics right and not just the fancy stuff that might be used 1% of the time or 5% of the time. Those things are important, but not at the risk of doing the basics right.
So if people want to find out more information about Meter, where should they go?
Yeah, we're super easy to find online, Meter, meter.com. And my email is anil@meter.com. I'm an engineer myself. I'd love to speak to folks in this community and get feedback and learn more.
Okay, you just gave out your email on a podcast, so that's on you, Anil. But I guess take them up on it if you're curious. We'll have other links in the show notes as well if you want to get more details. All right. Well, thank you, Anil, for joining us, and thanks to Meter for sponsoring this episode. And of course, thanks to you for listening. If you like this, you can find this and many more fine free technical podcasts and our community blog. It's all at packetpushers.net. You can hear us on Spotify. You could leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts. You can even join the conversation at packetpushers.net/community and follow us on LinkedIn. Last but not least, remember that too much networking would never be enough.